Everyone laughed when 72-year-old Harold Mercer bought the most abandoned house in Ash Hollow, Vermont. The roof was collapsing. The walls were rotting. Most people thought the place belonged in a landfill, not to a retired old man, but Harold never seemed to care. Every morning before sunrise, he measured the walls, repaired the broken beams, and carefully wrote notes in a small black notebook. Then, only days after he arrived, a wealthy developer offered him 5 times what he had paid for the property. Harold refused. That's when the entire town began asking the same question. What could possibly be hidden inside that forgotten house? They believed an old man was wasting the last years of his life. They were wrong. Within 1 month, that abandoned house would reveal a 40-year-old secret, restore an innocent man's honor, and leave an entire town speechless. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories of hope, redemption, and unforgettable mysteries, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's begin. A pale September mist drifted across the hills surrounding Ash Hollow, Vermont, softening every rooftop and empty field beneath the cool morning sky. Harold Mercer eased his old blue Ford pickup onto Maple Ridge Road, the engine humming with the familiar rhythm of a truck that had survived decades of honest work. The narrow road wound through maple trees already touched by the first hints of autumn. Golden leaves floated lazily onto the windshield before the wipers brushed them aside. At the very end of the road stood the house. It leaned slightly toward the woods, as if the passing years had become too heavy to carry. Half the porch had collapsed. Several windows were broken, their cracked glass reflecting the gray sky like tired eyes. Moss climbed over the wooden siding, while vines wrapped themselves around the porch posts with quiet determination. Most people saw a ruin. Harold saw something waiting. He shut off the engine but remained seated for nearly a minute, both hands resting on the steering wheel. His eyes traveled from the sagging roof to the stone foundation beneath the porch. Still standing, he whispered to himself. That mattered. He stepped out slowly, his knees protesting the long drive from Boston. Age had bent his shoulders slightly, but it had never weakened his attention to detail. Before unlocking the front gate, he crouched beside one of the foundation stones and pressed his fingertips against the weathered surface. Solid. His expression softened. The realtor watched impatiently. "You sure you don't want to negotiate?" the younger man asked. "Honestly, Mr. Mercer, nobody would have blamed you if you walked away." Harold simply shook his head. "The price is fair." The papers were signed within minutes. By noon, word had already spread across Ash Hollow. The old fool bought Walter Briggs' place. People watched from porches and kitchen windows as Harold unloaded 2 worn suitcases, a toolbox polished by decades of use, and several bundles of rolled blueprints tied with faded cloth straps. Nobody came over to help. Across the road, Margaret Collins watered flowers that clearly didn't need watering. She had lived on Maple Ridge for nearly 40 years and had seen plenty of newcomers arrive with grand dreams. Most stayed 6 months. Some didn't last 6 weeks. Yet something about Harold felt different. He wasn't admiring the scenery. He wasn't introducing himself to neighbors. He wasn't even looking inside the house first. Instead, he walked around the building 3 separate times. He measured distances with slow, careful steps. He examined every support beam. He tapped wooden posts gently with the handle of his hammer, closing his eyes after each hollow sound. Margaret frowned. "He isn't looking at a house," she murmured. "He is listening to it." Late that afternoon, Harold finally entered the living room. Dust danced through thin rays of sunlight, pushing past broken curtains. Furniture remained exactly where it had been left years earlier, covered beneath white sheets and silence. Nothing was touched. Not yet. His phone vibrated. Emily. He smiled before answering. "Dad." Her voice carried the familiar mixture of love and frustration. "Please tell me you've changed your mind." "I haven't." "You left your apartment, your friends, everything. For what? That house?" Harold looked around the empty room. "It's only a house if you don't know its story." Emily sighed. "You've been saying that for months." He remained quiet. Finally, he spoke. "There are a few things I have to finish before it's too late." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Emily knew her father well enough to understand that once he spoke with that kind of calm certainty, no argument would change his mind. "Just promise me you'll call." "I promise." That evening, another visitor arrived. Connor Blake stepped out of a black SUV, wearing polished boots and an expensive jacket that looked strangely out of place on Maple Ridge Road. He smiled confidently. "Mr. Mercer?" Harold nodded. "My name is Connor Blake. I own several properties around town." Harold waited. "I'll save us both some time." Connor pulled a business card from his pocket. "I'll give you 3 times what you paid for this place." Harold glanced at the house behind him, then back at Connor. "No." Connor blinked. "You haven't even spent one night here." "No." "You could triple your money." "I didn't come here to make money." Connor studied the old engineer for another moment before slowly slipping the business card back into his pocket. "You'll change your mind." Harold simply returned to inspecting the porch. After Connor drove away, twilight settled quietly over Ash Hollow. Inside the house, Harold lit a small lantern and sat at the old kitchen table. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he carefully removed a weathered envelope whose edges had darkened with age. The paper inside had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had nearly worn through. He unfolded it with both hands. A faded photograph slipped into his lap. 2 young engineers stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling beside a newly completed bridge. One of them was Harold. The other was Walter Briggs. Harold stared at the photograph for a long time before placing everything back into the envelope with almost reverent care. The next morning, Margaret happened to glance through the open kitchen window as Harold laid the photograph beside a notebook filled with precise repair plans. Her watering can slowly lowered. She recognized Walter immediately. The realization sent a chill through her. Harold Mercer hadn't bought this forgotten house by accident. He had come back for someone. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the broken windows as Harold carried his toolbox into the silent living room. Dust floated through the air like tiny memories refusing to settle. He wasn't renovating the house for comfort. He was searching for answers. Harold began by removing the warped wooden panels from the north wall. Years of moisture had loosened the nails, allowing each board to come away with careful pressure. Unlike an impatient contractor, he never forced the wood. Every movement was deliberate, every sound carefully observed. Nearly 2 hours passed. Then his hammer struck something that wasn't timber. A dull metallic knock echoed inside the wall. Harold froze. His heartbeat quickened. Using a pry bar, he slowly removed another section of paneling. Hidden between 2 old support studs rested a small rectangular metal box covered in rust and wrapped inside oilcloth that had somehow survived decades of damp Vermont winters. He carried it to the dining table before opening it. Inside lay 4 objects: a weathered leather journal, several faded black and white photographs showing the construction of the county's largest suspension bridge, an engineer's badge bearing Walter Briggs' name, and an unopened envelope addressed to no one. Harold picked up the journal first. Its first pages described ordinary construction meetings, weather reports, supply shortages, and long days spent supervising hundreds of workers. Walter's handwriting was neat and steady. Harold smiled faintly. "It hasn't changed," he whispered. As the entries progressed, the tone shifted. The optimism disappeared. The bridge project had fallen behind schedule. Funding was shrinking. Deadlines became impossible. Inspectors began visiting almost every week. Then came the entry dated October 14th. Harold read every word twice. A section of temporary scaffolding had collapsed during a morning inspection. Several workers never made it home. The newspapers blamed Walter Briggs within 24 hours. County officials accepted the conclusion almost immediately. The investigation ended before many of the surviving workers had even recovered from their injuries. Harold closed his eyes. He remembered the headlines. He remembered believing there had to be more to the story. He turned another page. There, written in darker ink than the rest, was a sentence that seemed almost carved into the paper. "I accepted the blame so other families could keep theirs." Harold remained motionless. His fingers trembled against the edge of the journal. Walter had confessed to something. But not because he believed he was guilty. He had sacrificed himself. The question was why. Another sentence near the bottom of the page caught Harold's attention. "Some truths protect lives. Others destroy them." Harold leaned back slowly. Someone had benefited from Walter's silence. Someone important. That afternoon, Margaret appeared carrying a basket of homemade blueberry muffins. "I figured you probably haven't eaten," she said awkwardly. Harold invited her inside. Her eyes immediately fell upon the photographs spread across the table. She recognized Walter's face instantly. "I always believed he wasn't responsible," she admitted quietly. Harold looked up. "You never said anything?" Margaret sighed. "Back then, nobody questioned the official report. If you defended Walter, people looked at you like you approved of the tragedy." She paused before continuing. "My husband worked near that bridge. He came home one night saying Walter looked more heartbroken than frightened." Harold listened without interrupting. "He kept saying," Margaret recalled softly, "Walter isn't acting like a guilty man. He's acting like someone protecting another person." The room grew silent. Margaret eventually stood to leave. Before closing the door, she turned back. "If you're looking for the truth, be careful." That warning stayed with Harold long after she disappeared down the road. Near sunset, the familiar black SUV rolled into the driveway once again. Connor Blake stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. "I've reconsidered my offer," he said confidently. "This time I'll pay 5 times what you spent." Harold didn't even glance at the paperwork. "My answer hasn't changed." Connor forced a smile. "You haven't found anything valuable in there." Harold met his eyes calmly. "I wasn't looking for valuables." Connor's smile faded. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. He left without another word. Night settled over Ash Hollow. Harold returned to Walter's journal beneath the warm glow of the lantern. Several pages near the back had been folded together. Inside one margin, Walter had written a name that had clearly been added later, almost as though he had hesitated before committing it to paper. Harold stared at the ink. His breathing slowed. The words explained everything. The man who had ordered the unsafe changes. The man Walter had protected. The real supervisor overseeing the bridge project. Was Thomas Blake, Connor Blake's own grandfather. A cold rain settled over Ash Hollow as Harold drove toward the Windsor County Archives, Walter's journal resting carefully on the passenger seat beside him. For 2 nights he had barely slept. One name echoed through his thoughts again and again. Thomas Blake. If Walter had written it, there had to be proof. The county archives occupied an old brick courthouse that smelled faintly of dust and aging paper. Most of the records had long since been forgotten, boxed away in narrow shelves beneath humming fluorescent lights. Harold requested every document connected to the Maple River Bridge disaster. The elderly archivist disappeared for nearly half an hour before returning with 6 heavy storage boxes. "You may be the first person to ask for these files in decades," she said. Harold quietly nodded. He spent the next several hours examining every report. At first, everything appeared ordinary: engineering reports, photographs, witness statements, insurance records. Then he noticed something strange. Several pages had been inserted using newer paper than the surrounding documents. Different typewriter ink, different paper texture. Someone had replaced part of the investigation. His heartbeat quickened. As he continued reading, another inconsistency appeared. 2 signatures approving the final safety inspection looked almost identical, but not quite. The handwriting slanted differently. The pressure of the pen changed halfway through each signature. Harold had reviewed thousands of engineering documents during his career. He knew forged paperwork when he saw it. Someone had altered the official record. The truth had not simply been forgotten. It had been rewritten. The archivist noticed Harold studying the signatures. "There used to be a court clerk who talked about this case," she said thoughtfully. "Is she still alive?" "I believe so. Eleanor Watkins lives just outside town." By late afternoon, Harold was sitting across from Eleanor on the porch of her farmhouse. She was 90 years old, her memory softened by time, but still remarkably sharp whenever the bridge disaster was mentioned. "I remember one thing clearly," Eleanor said. "There was supposed to be another witness." Harold leaned forward. "What happened?" She shook her head slowly. "He disappeared the night before the hearing." "Disappeared?" "He packed nothing, never collected his final paycheck. It was as if someone wanted him gone before he could testify." Harold thanked her and drove away with even more questions than before. The missing witness, the forged signatures, the altered reports. Every answer pointed toward a deliberate cover-up. Margaret later directed him to a small farmhouse outside Ash Hollow where the last surviving construction worker still lived. Samuel Reed answered the door with the help of a wooden cane. Age had bent his body, but not his eyes. The moment Harold introduced himself, Samuel stared for several long seconds. "I remember you," Samuel whispered. "You were the young engineer." Harold smiled sadly. "So you remember." "I remember everything." They sat together, overlooking a quiet field as the afternoon faded. Samuel's voice grew heavier with every memory. Walter wasn't running away when the scaffolding failed. He was running toward it. Samuel described the terrible morning in vivid detail. 3 workers had become trapped beneath collapsing steel. While everyone else fled, Walter climbed back onto the unstable structure. He pulled one man free, then another, then a third. Only after all 3 survived did the remaining scaffolding collapse completely. "He saved their lives," Samuel said. Harold lowered his head. "I know," Samuel continued. Later that day, Thomas Blake begged Walter to accept responsibility. Why? Because if the company admitted the design changes came from management, hundreds of workers would have lost their jobs. Families would have lost everything. Samuel sighed deeply. Walter chose to carry the blame alone. Silence settled between them. Finally, Harold spoke. "I should have testified." Samuel looked at him. "I was there that morning." Harold's voice trembled for the first time. "Walter pulled me away seconds before the platform gave way." He swallowed hard. He saved my life." The confession seemed to lift a burden Harold had carried for 40 years. "I wanted to speak." "What stopped you?" "I was young, afraid, and they convinced me nobody would believe me." The words tasted bitter. "I've regretted that decision every single day." Meanwhile, across town, Connor Blake sat alone in his office reading copies of the old reports Harold had quietly requested from the archives. For the first time in his life, he noticed the inconsistencies. His grandfather's name appeared where his father had always insisted it never existed. The foundation of everything Connor believed about his family's history began to crack. Back at Samuel's farmhouse, the old man disappeared into a bedroom before returning with a weathered cardboard tube tied with faded string. "I've protected this long enough," he said. Harold carefully untied the ribbon. Inside rested the original engineering blueprints for the Maple River Bridge. Across the bottom of the first page appeared Walter Briggs's authentic signature, beside handwritten safety corrections that had never appeared in the official files. Harold looked up in disbelief. Samuel nodded quietly. "That," he said, "is the truth they buried." The crisp October air carried the scent of fresh-cut pine as the first rays of sunlight reached Maple Ridge Road. For the first time in years, the abandoned house echoed not with silence, but with the sound of hammers and hopeful voices. Harold rolled the original blueprints across the old dining table. Unlike most renovations, his plans contained no modern additions. No larger windows, no open floor plan, no luxury finishes. Every measurement matched Walter Briggs' original design. "This house deserves to remember who built it," Harold whispered. The next morning, a familiar black SUV stopped outside. Connor Blake stepped out carrying a tool belt instead of a briefcase. Harold looked at him without speaking. Connor lowered his eyes. "I've read everything." Harold remained silent. "My father always said my grandfather was the man who saved the bridge company." He paused, struggling to continue. "The papers, Samuel's blueprints, Walter's journal, none of it matches the story I grew up believing." Connor swallowed hard before extending his hand. "I can't change what my family did. But if you'll let me, I'd like to help rebuild this house." Harold studied the younger man's face. There was no arrogance left, only regret. Without saying a word, Harold handed him a hammer. Connor smiled faintly. The work began. Within days, something remarkable happened. Margaret arrived carrying homemade sandwiches. The retired carpenter from 2 streets over offered to rebuild the porch. A local electrician volunteered to replace every wire at no cost. Even teenagers from the high school spent Saturday afternoons clearing brush and repainting fences. No one had organized the effort. The town simply came. Ash Hollow had spent 40 years remembering Walter Briggs as the man who caused a tragedy. Now people wanted to honor the man they should have defended long ago. Late one afternoon, another familiar vehicle stopped outside. Emily Mercer stepped out, carrying a small overnight bag. She hugged her father tightly. "You look tired." Harold smiled. "I feel lighter than I have in years." That evening they sat together on the rebuilt porch as Harold slowly unfolded the entire story. Walter's sacrifice, the forged documents, Samuel's testimony, the original blueprints, the missing witness. When he finished, Emily remained quiet for several moments. Finally, she asked the question she had carried since childhood. "Is this why you never accepted those engineering awards?" Harold looked toward the distant hills. "I didn't deserve them." Emily frowned. "You built bridges across half the Northeast." "I also stayed silent when the greatest engineer I ever knew was blamed for something he didn't do." His voice broke slightly. I spent 40 years pretending success could silence guilt. It never did. Emily reached over and gently squeezed his hand. For 40 years you punished yourself. Harold nodded. I thought I was honoring Walter. You weren't, she smiled softly. You were waiting until you had enough courage to finish what he started. Those words stayed with Harold long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Connor made a decision of his own. He gathered every family document stored in his office, including letters, contracts, company records, and his grandfather's private journals. The following morning he delivered everything to the county attorney. If my family's name helped bury the truth, he said quietly, it should help uncover it. News spread quickly through Ash Hollow. Connor Blake had chosen honesty over reputation. Not everyone understood his decision, but Harold did. 2 days later, Margaret climbed into the dusty attic searching for replacement roof boards. Instead, she discovered an old wooden trunk hidden beneath insulation. Inside rested a portable reel-to-reel tape recorder wrapped in a faded blanket. The machine barely functioned, but after several careful attempts, its tiny speaker crackled to life. A man's tired voice filled the room. Walter Briggs. I won't name anyone else. Static interrupted the recording, then Walter continued. If blaming me keeps hundreds of families working, let it be me. Another pause. I can live without my reputation. His voice grew softer. But I couldn't live with innocent children paying for the mistakes of grown men. The tape ended. No one in the room spoke. Even Connor quietly wiped tears from his eyes. There was no longer any doubt. Walter had chosen sacrifice willingly, fully understanding that history would remember him as a failure. That evening Harold drove into town alone. He stopped at a local stone workshop and handed the craftsman a sheet of paper. I'd like you to make a memorial plaque. The craftsman glanced at the folded note. What should it say? Harold smiled gently. You'll know when it's finished. He folded the paper again before anyone else could read it. For now, the words remained his secret. But Harold knew the day was coming when the entire town would finally read the truth, carved into stone. Golden afternoon sunlight bathed Maple Ridge Road as the restored house stood proudly beneath the colorful Vermont maples, looking exactly as it had more than 40 years before. Every porch rail had been rebuilt from Walter Briggs' original blueprints. Every window matched the dimensions he had drawn by hand. Every stone in the front walkway had been returned to its original place. It no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. By early afternoon, nearly the entire town of Ash Hollow had gathered in front of the house. Families stood quietly beside neighbors who, only weeks earlier, had laughed at the old man foolish enough to buy a forgotten ruin. Harold stood on the porch holding a small wooden box. Beside him were Emily, Margaret, Connor, and Samuel Reed. The old construction worker leaned heavily on his cane, determined to witness the ending Walter had never lived to see. Harold looked across the crowd before speaking. When I arrived here, he began, most people believed this house represented failure. He paused. I believed it represented unfinished truth. The crowd listened in complete silence. Harold carefully removed the contents of the wooden box. Walter's journal, the original engineering blueprints, the engineer's badge, the photographs, the altered investigation reports, the authentic signatures. One by one, he displayed each piece of evidence while explaining how Walter had accepted blame for a disaster he did not cause. He described the forged documents, the missing witness, the hidden journal inside the wall. Finally, Samuel stepped forward. His voice shook with age, but never with doubt. I watched Walter climb back onto that collapsing scaffold. He saved 3 men before the bridge came down. He wasn't running from danger. He was running toward it. Several people lowered their heads. Others quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Connor Blake then walked to the front of the gathering. For a long moment he simply looked at the restored house. "My grandfather made choices that changed this town forever," he said. "My family benefited from Walter Briggs' silence." His voice grew heavier. "I can't apologize for a man who is no longer here. But I can apologize for every year our family accepted a story we never questioned." He turned toward the crowd. "On behalf of the Blake family, I'm sorry." No one applauded. The silence itself carried far greater respect. A representative from the county government stepped onto the porch holding an official document. After reviewing the newly discovered evidence and conducting an independent investigation, the county formally declared that Walter Briggs had been wrongfully blamed for the Maple River Bridge tragedy. His engineering license was restored posthumously. His professional record was cleared. His honor officially returned. Harold smiled for the first time without sadness in his eyes. "This belonged here all along," he whispered. Together, Harold and Connor removed a cloth covering a bronze plaque mounted beside the front steps. The polished metal reflected the warm autumn sun. It read, "Walter Briggs, builder, protector, a good man." No one spoke for several seconds. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of 4 decades. As the ceremony quietly came to an end, Harold entered the house alone. The living room was peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the newly restored windows, illuminating the polished wooden floor. He reached into his jacket and carefully removed the weathered envelope that had traveled with him for 40 years. Inside remained Walter's final, unsent letter. Harold placed it gently on the old dining table, exactly where it had once belonged. He stepped back. "It can finally stay home," he whispered. Emily watched from the doorway. "I've made a decision," she said softly. Harold turned. "I want to keep this house," he smiled. "For yourself?" She shook her head. "For Walter." She looked around the room. "This isn't just a house anymore. It's part of this town's history. I'll preserve it so no one ever forgets what happened here." Harold felt something inside him finally settle. For years, he had feared that once the truth came out, there would be nothing left to do. Instead, he realized the truth had given others something worth protecting. The following morning, Harold packed the same 2 worn suitcases he had brought to Ash Hollow. This time, however, he did not leave unnoticed. Nearly the entire town lined Maple Ridge Road. Margaret hugged him tightly. Samuel saluted him. Connor thanked him for having the courage to uncover a truth his own family had hidden. Emily promised to return every weekend until the house was fully opened to visitors. As Harold climbed into his old Ford pickup, the people who had once mocked him now removed their hats in quiet respect. He started the engine and slowly drove toward the edge of town. At the final bend in the road, he stopped. The restored house stood proudly beneath the golden autumn sky, no longer carrying the weight of shame, but the dignity of truth. Harold smiled peacefully. He had never come to Ash Hollow simply to repair an abandoned house. He had come to restore a good man's name. And in doing so, he had finally repaired the broken place that had existed inside his own heart for more than 40 years. Sometimes, God doesn't perform miracles by changing our circumstances overnight. Sometimes, His greatest miracles happen quietly, through ordinary people who choose courage over comfort, truth over silence, and forgiveness over bitterness. Harold's journey reminds us that no lie lasts forever, and no act of kindness is ever forgotten in God's eyes. Even when the world misunderstands us, God sees every sacrifice, every tear, and every good deed that no one else notices. In His perfect time, truth has a way of finding the light. Maybe you're carrying a burden today. Maybe you've been judged unfairly, living with regret, or wondering if your efforts even matter. Don't lose hope. Keep doing what is right, even when no one applauds you. One faithful step at a time can change not only your own life, but the lives of people you'll never even meet. As for me, life hasn't always been easy. I'm raising 2 wonderful children on my own, and there are days when the responsibilities feel overwhelming. There are moments of exhaustion, uncertainty, and quiet struggles that no camera ever sees. But every morning I choose to move forward with gratitude, trusting that God is writing a better chapter than the one I can see today. That hope gives me strength, and I pray it gives you strength as well. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to read your thoughts and hear your own stories. Please share this video with someone who may need a little hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to support the channel. Your encouragement allows me to keep creating stories that remind us kindness, faith, and compassion still exist in this world. May God bless you and your family with peace, good health, wisdom, and unwavering hope. May He guide your steps, protect your loved ones, and fill your home with joy, even during life's hardest seasons. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until our next story, take care of yourself, keep believing in goodness, and remember, sometimes the greatest miracle isn't discovering a hidden treasure. Sometimes it's having the courage to restore someone's dignity and, in the process, finding peace within your own heart. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next story.